right. The few, the proud, the ones who actually stayed in town. And we're going to get somebody to get those lights on for you in just a second. Don't worry about it. Our light person's usually, our light person's out of town. And I forgot to have somebody turn just the middle ones on, the back ones up. That's perfect. All right, well, glad that you guys are here today. And we are in week 4 of a series called Awaken the Wonder. Awaken the Wonder. And the reality is that around Christmas time, you've heard this story so many times. It's been a part of your life since you were a kid, most likely. You've heard the story of, even if you didn't grow up in church, you probably at least heard the mention of the whole story of Jesus and what happened. You may have said, we don't believe that, but that's what people say happened. And you hear it in songs, you hear it on the radio, you see it in movies. And what can tend to happen when you hear something over and over again is that when you oversaturate yourself with something, it becomes less impressive. It becomes oversaturated and sometimes over boring, right? Like the first time you saw a great movie, you were like, that's fantastic. And then you watch it the 37th straight time and you're like, eh. And the reason is because you've oversaturated yourself with it. And what I fear happens sometimes is that we oversaturate ourselves with the Christmas story, with the story of Jesus being born. And it kind of comes to this place where we're just kind of like, yeah, Jesus was born. I got it. Now let's go look at lights. Jesus is born. I got it. Can I have some of those gingerbread cookies, right? Jesus was born. That's fantastic. Let's decorate the tree. And we kind of sometimes can lose sight of why this is so important. But I don't want us to do that. That's not going to be you. You're going to be a person that's going to walk around the rest of the day and you're just going to be like, wow, I can't believe that God sent Jesus to this world. That's amazing. And you're just going to have this sense of wonderment all day today, right? Okay, good. I can see it on your faces. You're going to do it. And everybody you come in contact with is going to be like, wow, that person's weird, right? And you're just going to be like, I know, it's incredible. But that's all right. Now, to get started with this today, I got to ask you guys a question. And I need full participation from everybody in the room, all 20 of you. Here's the deal. How many of you, when it comes to taking down your Christmas decorations, you're somebody that's like the second December 26th hit, we're taking it down. It's got to be down before lunchtime on the 26th. Okay, like 2 of you, okay, got it. How many of you are like, you know what, sometime that week, the 26th through the 31st, sometime before New Year's Eve, but it doesn't have to be immediately, kind of whenever we got time. How many of you would say that's kind of you? Okay, a couple more of you. How many of you are like, sometime around mid-January when I start to realize, hey, there's a tree still in our living room and there are some lights that don't belong there? How many of you that's kind of you? Okay, good. How many of you come middle of February, you start the debate, should I just leave them up? And just hope that by this time, hopefully nobody notices. And we actually had this one year where we decided, what we're going to do is we're going to leave. It was middle of January. We decided we're going to leave the tree decorated, and we're just going to carry it just like it is down to the basement. And we're just going to leave it set up there all year, but it wouldn't fit. We couldn't do it. We were very angry. We had to take the thing down. Okay, so this begins the question then, how early is too early to begin decorating for Christmas? Because if the middle of February, maybe a little bit early. My wife and Cracker Barrel would say that it's not too early, but most people would say the middle of February might be a little too early. Some people are like, the perfect time to decorate for Christmas is December 22nd. I saw somebody with a tree on top of their car yesterday heading home. That might be a little bit late. Some people say it's got to be right after Thanksgiving, that's the perfect time. My wife says right after Halloween is the perfect time to start decorating for Christmas. And whenever you decide that that's kind of up to you, we're not going to make fun of you or judge you for it. But what if I told you that God actually began decorating for Christmas centuries, even millennia before Jesus was ever born? What if I told you that if you wanted to follow God's example, you should start decorating for Christmas right now, next year, right? Because He started decorating for Christmas in the most fantastic, wonderful way that you could possibly imagine. And if you were here a couple years ago, you may have heard this story from me then, but I'm going to be willing to say that most of you weren't here, and the few of you that were here don't remember anything I said from 2 years ago, so we're probably safe with this. But there's this story, there's this period of time in Israel's history where God begins decorating for Christmas. And it couldn't have come at a worse time in the history of Israel. So think back to the history of Israel. I'm sure that you guys all know it, but let me just kind of break it down for you just in case. So God created everything, and then Israel kind of gets formed around the time of Abraham, and he makes this huge promise to Abraham that you're going to be a great nation, and the world's going to be blessed through you, all this stuff. And then some time goes by, and then they found themselves in Egypt, enslaved, right? And they don't know how are we ever going to get out of this? And then Moses came along, and he led them out of it, and he led them into the wilderness or the desert for a long time. And then there was this guy named Joshua, who was a warrior king or a warrior leader. We'll say he wasn't king, and he led them into what is known as modern-day Israel, and he fought all the enemies that were there, the Jericho thing, all that stuff that happened there, and they settled there. And then several hundred years later, there would be these kings that would come around, King Saul, and then ultimately King David, Solomon, all the way down the line. But there was this period of time right there in the middle after Joshua had led them in, and then he died, and before they started the kings, there was this 200 or 300 year period of time that was known as the time of the judges. Everybody say judges. Making sure you're with me. And this was a time in Israel's history where things were just about as bad as they could possibly be. The evil that was going on in the world and in Israel during this time has probably never been matched. And God chose this time period, the evil time period, the worst time period in Israel's history, to do something incredible, to do something amazing, to begin decorating for Christmas. And this is what was going on. This is why he had to rise up judges. This is what's going on during this period of time. It's found in Judges chapter 21, verse 25. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So in other words, there's no law, there's nobody to tell us what to do, and so we're just going to do what's right in our own eyes. I can't imagine a culture that would live that way, right? Except for, here's the deal, we kind of add this modern caveat to that. We say, I'm going to do what I want, what's right in my own eyes, as long as nobody gets hurt, right? And we justify it, and we think we're okay in doing so. But that's the kind of culture that they lived in, and so everybody did what they wanted to do. Everybody was king of their own lives. And amazingly enough, it was right in the midst of all of this that God began working on or setting the stage for a king that would come and do incredible, wonderful things. And he uses two very unlikely people. He uses a woman who ends up announcing, and we'll read about this in a little bit, she ends up announcing to her entire village that God has abandoned her, that she doesn't believe in God anymore, that if there is a God, he can't really care about what's going on in her life because her circumstances showed that there is no God. And he used this guy who he had no evidence of God. He had no reason to believe that through his circumstances, he had every reason to believe that God wasn't there, but that he chose to honor God anyway. And we're going to see how their story God uses it in a powerful way to set up Christmas, to set up Jesus being born. So if you have your Bible, we're going to turn to our traditional Christmas Eve Sunday morning book of Ruth. You hear this all the time on Christmas Eve in churches. Ruth, which is like, 8th chapter of the Bible, all the way back in the Old Testament. And you may have heard this story, but you didn't realize that it was during the time of the judges, or during the time when Israel was so far from God. And what's so amazing about this is that God had set them up to be his special people. He had set them up to be his nation, to be a blessing to the entire world. And they just said, yeah, that's okay, we don't want it anymore. And they were just kind of like, we want to be like everybody else. And so that's what they're in the midst of doing. And then God begins doing this. If you have your Bible, Ruth chapter 1. If not, it's going to be up on the screen behind me. It goes like this. In the days when the judges ruled, there's our guys, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, just so you guys are all clear on where Moab is in relation to Israel, if you look at the Holy Land, if you're looking at Israel and you head straight east and you cross the Dead Sea and then you go a little bit south, there's Moab. So if that's on your Christmas travel plans, now you know how to get there. Straight south there, you get to Moab. And when they got to Moab, the man's name was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were so hard to pronounce that I didn't even want to try. We would just end up embarrassing ourselves. And they were Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah, and they went into the country of Moab and remained there. So you got 4 Israeli people living in Moab, doing as the Moabites do. And they get there, and their sons begin to grow, and then there becomes a problem. Their sons get old enough, and they want to get married. But God had warned Israel specifically not to marry people from this region, and not because they weren't supposed to marry people of different races or people of different ethnicities. Churches tried for years to say that, but that wasn't it at all. The reason that he didn't want them marrying people from there is because they had gods. They had idols that were set up in place of God, and he knew that when his people married them, they married their gods also. And so he was actually trying to protect them. And so they've got this huge dilemma. What do we do with our 2 sons who want to get married? But you guys know the saying, right? When in Moab, you marry Moabite women. So they married their sons off to Moabite women and their gods, and they began to have an influence on them. And then over the course of some time, what happens next is that Elimelech dies. Elimelech dies. And then Naomi's oldest son died, tragically. And then her youngest son died. And so now Naomi is stuck living in Moab with her 2 daughters-in-law being the only family that she has anywhere near her. And she eventually gets so upset, so depressed, so angry with God that she kind of announces, God has abandoned me. This is not what I signed up for. I'm going to go back to my home country. I'm going to go back to my hometown of Bethlehem, and I'm just going to stay there, and I'm just going to live there, be cool there. Everything's going to be great. And she tells her daughter-in-laws, listen, I know that you guys are kind of connected to me now, but I want you to go get married to a couple Moabite guys, and I'm just going to go back to my hometown. And one of the daughter-in-laws takes her up on that, and the other daughter-in-law says, you know what, I'm actually not going to do that. I made a commitment to your family, and I'm going to honor the commitment that I made to your family, and so I'm going to come with you. And Ruth begins to try to talk her, or Naomi begins to try to talk Ruth, the daughter-in-law, out of this. She says, no, you don't understand. This is going to be an incredibly dangerous journey across the sea, across the land, and you're not Israeli. They're not going to take to you very well, and I'm not going to be around very much longer. I'm going to die soon, and if you come over, then you're going to be a Moabite woman living alone in Bethlehem in Israel. That's not going to be a safe place for you. You don't need to do this. But Ruth gives one of the most beautiful answers to this. It's one of the most famous verses in the entire Bible. Check out what she says to Naomi. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. In other words, Naomi, I am with you. I know that you want me to stay here, but I'm not going to let you go alone. I'm not going to let you die alone, and so I'm coming with you. And so they set out, and they head back to Bethlehem, and they get there, and they start living their life, and people in Bethlehem, they begin to whisper. You know how small towns work, right? They begin to whisper, is that Naomi? Where's her husband? Where are her 2 sons? What's going on? You know, what's happening? I'm sure if this was in modern day, the internet scandal would have been massive, right? But this time they had no clue what was going on. And so they begin to whisper and to wonder, why is this Moabite woman with her? What happened? You know, did she lose a bet? What's going on here? And so they just go to her and ask her. They say, hey, listen, are you Naomi? And you know what she says? No, I'm not Naomi. I used to be Naomi, but now I want you to call me Mara, or Mara, M-A-R-A, which means bitter. I literally want you to call me bitter because God has taken from me my husband and my sons, and he has brought me back here empty. Matter of fact, she says it this way. She says this, call me bitter because I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? In other words, God isn't real. And what's so amazing about this, and this is kind of goes true, she's kind of echoing or mimicking all of Israel at this moment. What's so true is I think that everybody in Israel at this point, they had heard all these stories about all that God had done, right? They had heard these stories about how God had taken them up out of Egypt, and they had walked on dry ground on a riverbed, right? And that they had conquered nations just by walking around the wall. And they heard all these stories, but at some point they began to say, you know what? I'm just not so sure this is true. I think these are myths that my parents told me to make me behave. right? You ever tell your kids things, parents, you ever tell your kids things that aren't true to make them behave? Like, hey, if you don't stay in your bed, there's a monster that's going to eat your leg, right? Anybody? Anybody? Am I the only one? Okay, my kids are probably going to need therapy. Anyway, yeah. But I think that they begin to think to themselves, you know what? All these stories, they're myths to try to make us behave, to try to keep us in line, but they're not true. And so Naomi says, you know what? I just think this isn't real, and so I have abandoned my relationship with God. And so they begin to live their life there. Now, this was the barley harvest season in which they came back, and I'm sure that you guys all know what that means, but just as a refresher of what it means to be in the barley harvest season. So the planters would plant barley in their fields, and then there would come time for the harvest of the barley, and according to the law that they still kept, the planters, the owners of the field, they could only send their servants out one time to collect all the barley, all the harvest that they could collect, and anything that grew after that had to be left there for the poor, for the widows, and for the children of the community. And so people would come to these fields, and these fields were dangerous places. They would come and they would try to get anything that's left, and if they found somebody weaker, they would take all that they had collected as well, and it was just a really dangerous place. But Naomi says to Ruth, the daughter-in-law, listen, if we're going to survive, you're going to have to go out into the fields, and you're going to have to collect barley if we're going to make it. And so I know that this is going to be extremely dangerous for you, Ruth. You're a Moabite woman living in Israel. People are going to think that you're just trying to take advantage of their generosity or steal from us, but you're going to have to go out anyway. And so she goes out into the field, and she picks the field of a man named Boaz, who was actually a very distant relative of Naomi's old husband Elimelech. And so she goes and she picks this field of a guy named Boaz, and Boaz begins to notice that she's out there, and he begins to look around and be like, who is this Moabite woman that's out picking in our fields? What's going on with the story? And again, he can't Google it, and so he begins to look around and try to figure out from all the people in the town what's going on, and they eventually tell him. The reality is that she's the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and she came back with her, and she honored her commitment to be a part of her family, even though Naomi released her from it, and he began to get impressed with her. He began to say, you know what, that's really cool, and they have this cool moment where they talk, and this is what he says to her. He says, but Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. In other words, Ruth, I'm kind of impressed with you. And so he tells all of his servants, listen, you need to protect her. Make sure that she gets as much as she wants from this field, and make sure that nobody messes with her. And so she goes and she collects all that she can, and Naomi starts talking to her. She's like, how are you getting so much every single time? How are you so successful at this? And she says, well, it's because I went to a person's field named Boaz. And Naomi's like, Boaz, I know him. That's incredible. And Naomi gets this weird idea. This crazy plan comes into Naomi's head. She says, you know what you need? Ruth, you know what you need? You need this thing called a kinsman redeemer. Everybody say kinsman redeemer. It could also be translated avenger, right? Not like Iron Man, Captain America, or Captain Israel, I guess it would be. None of that. It's a person who's kind of like this distant relative that would come around, and he would do a number of things, but if you were in desperate need, if your family needed something desperately, he would come around and he would help. He could help. He didn't have to help, but he could help. And there were actually 4 things that a kinsman redeemer could do. Number 1, he could take on a debt that you had taken on, or he could give you a loan or pay your bills for a short period of time. If you were in a really, really bad spot, couldn't pay your own bills, couldn't figure out how you were going to make it, he could come around and he could help you with that or give you a small loan. Another thing that he could do is he could buy back property that had been taken from you because you owed money. And so if you owned a house or a field and you owed somebody money and they came and they seized it from you, he could come and he could buy it back and give it to you. That's another thing that he could do. This is kind of a sad one that he could do. He could actually redeem or buy back relatives that had been sold into slavery because of their debt. So if you owed a great debt to somebody, they could come and they could either take you or take your kids to be their slaves to pay off the debt. And the kinsman redeemer could come in and he could take care of that. And another thing that he could do is he could provide a male heir to the family. If you only had daughters, this was big in this culture. If you only had daughters and he had multiple sons, he could provide a male heir to take over your family's property, to take over your family's business, those kind of things. And so Naomi gets this idea. We need Boaz to be your and our kinsman redeemer, Ruth. And Ruth begins to say, why would he do that? First of all, you're getting older, right? And I'm getting older. And this is something that you never need to notice about the women in your life, by the way, especially guys. My wife keeps getting younger year after year. It's amazing. I don't know how it happens. But she says, you're getting older, I'm getting older. We need this desperately. But it's not going to work. He's probably not going to take you on just, we need to take this up a notch. I know he lets you pick the barley from his fields scot-free right now. So we need to ask him if he'll marry you. Right? That's kind of a big leap, right? Not only do we need him to buy the fields back for us, to give us some money, but we actually need him to take you on as a family member, which is going to be interesting because now he's probably going to have more kids. It means he's going to have to split the inheritance different ways. It's going to be a big responsibility for him. And so Ruth somehow gets convinced that this is a good idea. And so she goes to Boaz and she begins to ask him, will you be my avenger? Right? Will you be my kinsman redeemer? But more than that, will you bring me into your family and be my husband? What do you think Boaz says? He says, yes, amazingly so. But remember what I told you about Boaz. He was a guy that wanted to honor God. And so there was one more thing. This is really important to the story. There was one more thing that had to happen. There was actually somebody else, a closer relative, that had to be asked first if he wanted to be the avenger, if he wanted to be the kinsman redeemer. And so he goes and he tells them all that he's going to have to do. And check out what happens. Verse 5 of chapter 4. It says, then Boaz said, the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead and his inheritance. The Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So the other guy says no, but this is so important to the story because Boaz was a man who, even though he could have done whatever he wanted and that other guy would have never known, he wanted to honor God with every decision that he made. And so he said, I'm going to do this the honorable way. And so what happens next? He marries Ruth. He redeems the family. And they kind of live happily ever after. Now, we could just end the story right there. That's a really great story, right? I mean, you got an honorable guy meets honorable girl out in the field at barley harvest season. It's the everyday love story that you hear about all the time. They could make a movie out of this, right? But it actually doesn't end there. That's just the beginning of it because God was doing something even bigger right in the midst of all of this. It's incredible because Ruth and Boaz, they would go on to have a son named Obed, O-B-E-D, Obed. And there's this really awesome moment. You got to read the book of Ruth and read all through this. It's incredible. There's this really awesome moment at the end of Ruth where grandma of Obed is sitting in her old rocking chair. I kind of imagine this at the end of her life, and she's holding baby Obed. And she says, you know what? Maybe God didn't abandon me. Maybe God has been working through this all along. And what's so amazing is that she thought that God had abandoned her, but guess who we're talking about 3,500 years later? We're talking about Naomi. In a time when people did not, especially women, did not have their stories recorded, her story was recorded so that everybody could be a part of reading it for the rest of history. It's amazing to think that she was actually at the epicenter of God's biggest moment in history. And she's holding baby Obed and she says, God has not abandoned me. God is with me. And then Obed, he grows up and Naomi dies. And then Boaz, his dad, dies. And then eventually Ruth, his mom, dies. But Obed grows up and he has a son named Jesse. And then Jesse grows up and guess what? He has a bunch of sons, like a lot of sons. And one day, God says, I'm going to do something brand new in all of Israel. Something that you guys have never seen before. Something that you guys have never heard before. This is going to be special. I'm going to bring in the age of kings because you guys want me to. And he sent this prophet named Samuel to come and he sent him to talk to Jesse. He said, I want you to go to Jesse's house and I want you to tell Jesse that one of his sons has been picked, has been decided on to be king of Israel. And so he goes to Jesse's house and he says, one of your sons is going to be king. And if you're a guy living in ancient Israel and somebody comes to your house and says, hey, one of your sons is going to be king. It doesn't even, you're just like, just take one. It doesn't even matter which one because I'm going to be the king. And so he says to line up all your sons along this row. And he goes one by one. He looks like a king, but he's not the king. He looks like a king, but he's not the king. One after the other, all the way down the line. He's not the king. He's not the king. And finally, he gets to the end of the line, and he's not the king. And then he kind of asks this really, really embarrassing question. He says, do you have any more sons? Because you would think on the day that one of your sons is going to be picked to be king, that you would bring them all there, right? But he didn't. He says, actually, no, there's one more out in the fields, but let me tell you, he is not the king. Okay, one of these guys is the king. That kid's not the king. And Samuel said, I'm not going to sit down until you go get him. And so they go and get him, and they bring him back. And into the scene of history walks David, King David, son of Jesse, son of Obed, son of Boaz, a man who dared to honor God in the midst of a culture where nobody honored God. Then, David grew up. He became king. And another prophet named Nathan this time came to David, and he said these words. He said this in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16. He says, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. And so they knew at this point that if there was going to be a king, a Messiah, a forever king in Israel, that it was going to come from the line of David. And so this was an amazing moment. King David, son of Jesse, son of Obed, son of Boaz, who honored God, who dared to honor God in the midst of a people, of a culture who did not honor God. And then years later, matter of fact, 25, so David has a son who has a son who has a son who has a 25 pregnancies later, or to use a more biblical term, 25 begats later, if you're reading through these genealogies in the Bible, you get to this right here, Matthew chapter 1, verse 15 and 16. And Eliud, the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar, the father of Mathan, and Mathan, the father of Jacob, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, and the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ, or who is called Messiah. And what's so amazing is that 25 pregnancies later, after David, son of Jesse, son of Obed, son of Boaz, a man who honored God in the midst of a time when nobody honored God, Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, the king that's going to be king forever, walks onto the scene of history. And it all began because God started decorating for Christmas thousands of years before this moment at maybe the worst time in the history of the nation of Israel. Isn't that incredible? And then one day, I mean, even the people that were around at this time, they even thought Jesus was the king, right? Like the wise men came from far, 900 miles away to find Jesus the king. And then even Herod, the evil king, the one that we talked about last week, he even thought Jesus was a king. I mean, why else would he send all these people to murder him if he didn't think he was a king? And then one day, years later, Jesus would be standing in front of a guy named Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate asked him, are you a king? And he said, yeah, I'm a king, but John chapter 18, he says, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. In other words, I'm a king, but not the way that you think of a king. I'm going to be the king of hearts of people. I'm going to be the king in the lives of millions, even billions of people throughout the rest of history. And I wonder if Pilate at that moment just laughed at Jesus. He was kind of like, yeah, I don't think so. But what's so amazing now is that Pontius Pilate, who was a popular figure during this period of time, is kind of just a footnote in the history of Jesus now. It's amazing to think about. And Jesus steps on the scene all because of Boaz and Ruth decided that they were going to honor God in the midst of a culture where nobody honored God. And God began decorating for Christmas thousands of years ago. So if you want to start decorating for Christmas early this year, you go right ahead and do it. Father, thank you so much for this lesson, God, and I pray that there are so many things that we could be taught from this. Number one, that we can honor you even when nobody else around us is honoring you. God, I pray that you would teach us to trust in you even when we can't see the evidence of you working around us. that we can trust that you're working in ways that we can't see. And God, I pray that you would help us to make you the king of our heart and our lives, that we wouldn't look to do just what we want, but that we would look to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Take that connection card that's sitting in your seat. Take a few seconds and fill that thing out. We are going to continue to worship this morning by receiving of our morning tithe and offering. And while we are doing that today, I want you to check out this video that's going to roll starting 2 weeks from today on January the 7th. We are going to be launching into a brand new series called Double Dog Dare Part 2, and I'll tell you about it in just a second. But check out this video while we're receiving the offering this morning.
Rules of the Double Dog Dare. Listen closely. It begins with two opposing sides. Side 1 presents a seemingly insurmountable challenge known as a dare to Side 2. This dare is riddled with abounding risk, oftentimes with severe physical and social implications. When challenged, Side 2 must accept or refuse the dare presented. Refusing is equally, if not more detrimental to one's social standing than actually accepting the dare and failing miserably. If Side 2 reluctantly declines the dare, then of course the challenger is forced to raise the stakes and extend the ultimate requisition, the Double Dog Dare. Everything is on the line. Risk it all and walk proudly in achievement, or lose and walk home with your tail between your legs. Only you can decide.
All right, beginning 2 weeks from today, Double Dog Dare. How many would love to have 2018 be the best year of your life? Yeah, I think we can do some things that are going to set you up for that. So you're going to receive 4 dares. 4 things that I would dare you to do. And I want you to just pick one of those things that you're going to focus on in 2018 that's going to set you up to have the greatest year of your life. So make sure that you're here next week and starting January 7th for this new series. Now, don't tell God that I let you out 6 minutes early today on Christmas Eve. But you guys have a great Sunday. We will see you back either today at 4 o'clock for a kind of a different candlelight thing, or next Sunday at 9 or 10:30. Have a great day, guys.